Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. Now, US President Donald Trump delivered what is known as the State of the Union Address. And as always with Trump, there was drama, rhetorical flourishes and controversy. Now, the State of the Union Address is an annual event. It was Trump's third such speech after 2018 and 2017. What it essentially does is to give a report card to the US citizens about the state of the economy, foreign relations and other domestic issues, including a legislative agenda, bills that a president would want the legislature to pass so that it could be signed into law. What were some of the highs and lows, hits and misses of Trump's speech? What did he speak about and what did he omit from his speech? How was it different from his previous State of the Union addresses? Over the next 30 minutes, we'll try to answer all those questions and more so that you, the viewer, knows what it takes to be on top of the news. But first, let me bring you up to date with key highlights from Trump's speech. I'll start with Trump's report card on the economy. Now, talking about the economy, Trump spoke about how 7 million new jobs have been added to the US workforce. He spoke about the unemployment level, which is the lowest in over 5 decades. Moving on to the next highlight from the report card, he spoke about the African American poverty, which was at its lowest. Moving on, unemployment rate for women lowest in 7 decades. Next up is the fact about in 2019, women filled 72% of all new jobs added. And wages are rising and rising regularly in the US. Trump calls it a blue-collar boom. And finally, real median household income is at its highest as well. Right, moving on, another recurring theme in Trump's speech was energy. He said it last year and he said it again this year that the US is the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world today, and the US is now energy independent. All right, in another highlight of the Trump speech was the recognition accorded to Rush Limbaugh. If you're wondering who Rush Limbaugh is, he is an American radio personality and he was awarded the US's highest civilian honor. It's called the Medal of Freedom. Now, moving on, Limbaugh has advanced lung cancer, announced it just a few days ago before his recognition, and he's been hosting the Rush Limbaugh Show for 31 years and counting. Now, the Medal of Freedom is given to individuals for meritorious contributions to American society. And US First Lady Melania Trump placed the medal on the visibly surprised Limbaugh, and look at his facial expression turning from disbelief to ecstasy and joy. So that is Rush Limbaugh for you. All right, as I mentioned before, controversies marked Trump's speech. They sprang from Trump's running feud with Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the lower chamber of the US legislature. Now, controversy number 1, Pelosi extends her hand to Trump, but Trump refuses to shake hands with her. He turns his back on Pelosi, and Pelosi's facial expression afterwards said it all. Right, controversy number 2, Pelosi was not one to forget Trump's snub. Towards the end of Trump's speech, Pelosi took the sheaf of papers in her hand and literally tore the copy of Trump's speech apart. Now take a look at the third and last set of photographs. Remember Pelosi's sarcastic clap that went viral last year? Now that should tell you something about their relationship, or well, the lack of it. Clearly, there's no love lost between the two. According to some reports, the two have not spoken in a while now. So that was a sneak peek into the big takeaways from the Trump speech. Now let me quickly run you through the remainder of the news. Trump delivered his third State of the Union address. He addressed a joint session of the US legislature, speaking from the lower chamber of the legislature. In it, Trump put forth the point that he has revitalized the US. With the US presidential election due in November, Trump used his speech to claim credit for what he called a great American comeback and revival of American spirit. Trump defined the coming campaign against the Democrats as a battle to stop the rise of socialism in the US. In his address, Trump said that in just 3 years, his government has shattered the mentality of American decline and his government rejected the downsizing of America's destiny.
Jobs are booming, incomes are soaring, poverty is plummeting, crime is falling, confidence is surging, and our country is thriving and highly respected again. America's enemies are on the run, America's fortunes are on the rise, and America's future is blazing bright. The years of economic decay are over. We're moving forward at a pace that was unimaginable just a short time ago, and we are never, ever going back.
But as I said before, it was the bitter feud between Trump and Nancy Pelosi that hogged headlines the world over, with Trump snubbing her outstretched hand and Pelosi ripping apart a copy of Trump's speech behind his back. Interestingly, Trump avoided the subject of his impeachment drama in the 80-minute speech, but the scars from the battle were evident, with fellow Republicans giving him standing ovations, while rival Democrats, for the most part, remained seated. The Republican-led Senate, the upper chamber of U.S. legislature, was expected to acquit Trump on 6 February of charges that he abused his powers and obstructed the legislature. All right, two very special guests now join me in the studio. Meera Shankar, a former Indian ambassador to the U.S. Incidentally, Ambassador Shankar was India's second lady ambassador to the U.S., Vijayalakshmi Pandit being the first to hold that post in the late 1940s and early 50s. Also joining me is Dr. Harinder Sekhon. Dr. Sekhon is a consultant with Vivekananda International Foundation, a New Delhi-based think tank. She has over 3 decades of research, writing and teaching experience on various aspects of India-US relations. Ladies, thank you for making time for this discussion. Appreciate it. If I can come to you first, Ambassador Shankar, your thoughts on Trump's State of the Union speech, and did he tick the right boxes for you?
Well, I think it's very evident that this is a speech going into a presidential campaign.
Right.
In the past, especially in his last speech, Trump had spoken of the endless possibilities of cooperation, compromise, and working together for the common good. And this time there was none of that.
True.
It was a very partisan agenda, and basically showcasing his accomplishments and pushing across the themes that have been there in his presidency and will perhaps also define his coming campaign. So the success on the economy, it has been doing well, but perhaps not as well as President Trump had projected. He had projected a growth rate of over 3%. I don't think that's going to be reached. It'll be 2-point-something%. We don't know the final figures. Unemployment down to record lows of 3.6%. But the bulk of that having been achieved during President Obama's term, because unemployment came down from 10% to 4.8% during President Obama's term, and from 4.8% to 3.6% during President Trump's term. But of course, he's fortunate to be the person on the spot when it has come down to 3.6%. And you know, the protectionism on the trade front playing well with his working class constituency in the swing states. On healthcare, he's taken a completely Republican position, you know, saying he will not allow the socialists to take over healthcare.
Right.
And again, on many other issues, you know, he has repeated most of the themes of the past. So you can see in one sense from his speech and from the controversies between him and Nancy Pelosi, how divisive U.S. been a broad consensus on foreign policy. But under Trump, it is foreign policy which perhaps divisions on it play in this election. In past elections, it really hasn't played that much of a role. So Trump's effort will be not to talk of foreign policy so much, but to focus on the economy, where the polls show that the majority of Americans think he has done a good job.
Indeed. Dr. Sekho, as Ambassador Shankar pointed out, the focus clearly was on domestic issues, given the fact that US goes to the polls in November this year. So in your estimation, with having watched Trump speak in his address this morning, was Trump conciliatory or as combative as ever?
See, his tone was not very combative. He was, the tone was very mellow, very mild. But I think there was a certain underpinning of sarcasm throughout his speech. And he has put his point across, as has been mentioned by Ambassador Shankar. It is definitely a speech with the election in mind and his re-election bid.
Sure.
And he has tried to reach out to his constituency. And the most important point is the US election is always about, as any democratic electoral process, it's all about domestic issues actually. Foreign policy is on the periphery, and even the last time in 2016 he talked of foreign policy by promising to bring the jobs back to America, making sure that China would not be a currency manipulator. So it was linked to the economic resurgence of the United States, which he was promising to the electorate. And I think coming as he has, coming down very heavily on China in the trade war, and now the coronavirus, fortunately for Trump, I think he just leads a cat's charmed life, because things just happen at the right time, and he somehow gets to reap the benefit of natural forces, international forces. But and the jobs, you see, these were processes which do not happen overnight. And it's a continuation process, but you know, he is very articulate and he's able to kind of drive home a point and take credit. And there is a great deal of skepticism about the real rate of growth in the United States. So I think we will see soon, you know, but this is definitely a speech with an eye. That is why he talks about, again, American resurgence, creating further jobs, as you have brought out those bullet points in the beginning, creating 7 million jobs, and African American, reaching out to the women voters. So he has categorized.
So he stayed on the message, so to speak.
He has, you know, he wants to reach out to the women voters, the Hispanics, the American, the Afro-American voter. So I think this speech is designed to kickstart his electoral campaign, and coming as it does just a day after the Iowa, you know, primaries.
So in that sense, you know, Ambassador Shankar, did he sound presidential at all to you, or you think he's the same Trump that we saw in his SOTU speeches the last couple of years?
Well, he hasn't ad-libbed so much in this speech. He's stuck on message, and he's been more disciplined in terms of staying on message. In the past, he has tended to meander off course. So that, I think, was one thing which was clearly discernible. And you can see that his core constituency remains solidly with him. You know, whatever the 39 to 40% Republican conservative constituency. And you see that in the fact that during the impeachment process in the Senate, the Democrats were not able to win even 4 Republican senators, which would have enabled them to call additional witnesses to testify. They only got 2. Which means that the Republicans are solidly behind him, and he's going to, you know, the impeachment is going to be set aside by the Senate. Now in this, for the first time, you see, he's trying to make an effort to reach out to independents and to minorities, you know, and to women. And he's doing it on the basis of his economic achievement, saying that, you know, never has unemployment amongst you know, African Americans or Hispanics or Asian Americans been so low as it is today. And the same thing with women, that as the economy has risen, it has lifted all boats, and therefore the minorities and women and everybody have benefited. But I'm not sure how much this is going to work. Women were divided in the last election. White women without university degrees voting overwhelmingly for Trump, white women with university degrees voting a little more for Hillary, and African Americans not coming out in sufficient numbers, you know, to vote for Hillary. She did get their majority.
Once a commentator in the US used the word white lash to describe 2016 election
Yes.
verdict.
Yes, I would agree. It was in some sense a reflection of white anxiety about demographic change and about power and economy within the United States. Who gets to control it? Who dominates it? Are things changing? I think in a sense you're very right. It was a backlash to that. And added to it was the question of working class Americans left behind by globalization, who felt that the traditional elites were not paying attention to them. You know, the Midwest states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, you know. And so these which were considered, you know, solid democratic walls all swung Trump's way, and that actually led to the surprising electoral result.
Right.
And today that constituency is still very much with him, but still in the overall picture, more Americans disapprove of Trump than approve of him. So he's trying to get that independent middle ground to swing.
The fence sitters
Yeah.
or the, right,
To swing.
indeed. Dr. Sekhon, if I were to ask you to dwell a bit, if you will, on the comparisons between his speech this year and his last two speeches. Now, one thing that stands out, and if I can go through my notes here, in 2019, last year, he spoke about the so-called caravans coming in from Latin America, and he dwelled at some length on illegal immigration. He spoke about how the US, how American citizens were killed by the illegal aliens, and that if I can quote from there, he said, "Walls work and walls save lives." He also spoke about the recurrent theme was the China trade issue, burden sharing with NATO. Russia figured prominently, spoke about INF and missile defense systems for the Americans themselves, North Korea, Venezuela, West Asia, and he said about great nations do not fight endless wars, ISIS, Syria, Afghanistan, Iran. So in your sense, was foreign policy not a dominant theme this year?
That's what comes out, because his first State of the Union articulated a more vigorous US policy of reaching out to people and settling issues, especially Afghanistan. That was one of his election, it was on his election manifesto that he would bring the troops back home. And then he started doing a mid-course correction, because when he realized that it is not so easy to extricate yourself from Afghanistan. And last year, as you have just given a recap, I think there were a lot of points on foreign policy which he ticked, and he has acted on each one of them, whether it is taking on Russia, China, North Korea. He did extended the olive branch to North Korea. Things may not have worked that well, but the fact of the matter is, I think what has really created an impact as far as his domestic constituency is concerned is reining in China on the trade war. Though he has got a limited trade deal with China, but I think, and his own messaging is so good, propaganda is so good, that he's been able to say that he has got China where he wants. So this year it is definitely, because he's going to go, he has, he'll formally announce his candidature later in the year in North Carolina. So I think from now to then, you'll only see him focusing increasingly on domestic politics. And he would want to send this clear message, because Indo-Pacific, I've not gone through the speech in great detail, but that also does not focus so much this year as it did last year. And though we know that that is one of the priority areas for the United States and for Trump, but I think the focus is going to be on energy, job creation, and on development. I think another major theme he touched upon, and that is the only theme where he was able to get some kind of a response from the Democrats when he talked about infrastructure development.
Sure.
So he is definitely looking at re-election. And what helps him is a very divided democratic field on the other side. So that is an advantage as far as he is concerned, and his 40% core white conservative constituency. So he sits very comfortably, and he would want to further strengthen his gains as far as his electoral victory is concerned.
Right. I want to ask one last question to both my guests. Now, President Trump is expected to visit India soon. What might be on the agenda from India's perspective, and what's the next big idea in India-US ties, irrespective of who comes to power after the elections in November?
Well, I'm not sure that right now both sides would be discussing big ideas. I think they are discussing probably a small trade deal to be able to try to get trade differences out of the way. At least that, I think, is the American expectation, because President Trump, having got the trade deal, partial trade deal with China, having renegotiated the NAFTA agreement.
And having written the book titled Art of the Deal.
So I think he would really want to show that he has some modus vivendi on trade with India. That would be his focus. From India's point of view, trade is one issue. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the strategic elements of the relationship get enough focus and are not obfuscated by this transactional trade relationship, because the overall driver really is the increasing coincidence of interests to the west of India in Asia. May not necessarily be, to the east of India, in Asia. To the west, there may be issues, for instance, a very hasty deal with the Taliban would be topmost of India's concerns, because it could destabilize the region. President Trump's propensity to offer unwanted mediation in Kashmir, these are all issues which are there, and those anxieties need to be discussed and settled. But clearly to the east of India, in the Indo-Pacific as it is now called, there is an increasing coincidence of strategic interests, and both India and the US need to build upon that.
Dr. Sekho, you get the last word.
I think it's going to be, from India's point of view, it's technology, and that is where, because we have a commonality of interest when it comes to the Indo-Pacific and also in the maritime domain. We seek technology from the United States, and I think a major focus and a major effort from our side is going to be, which would actually even straddle the economic domain. Because if trade is not going to move forward, we can announce some big announcements in DTTI and Prime Minister's Make in India by announcing, say one joint production mechanism or a platform. That would be because India seeks the technology. And secondly, I think Trump is also looking at doing a repeat of Howdy Modi. So the Gujarat event is going to be to tap into the business community and the Indian American community back home, which is a very important vote bank.
And they've come of age.
They've come of age, and they're very liberal funders to the US campaign as well. So I think Trump is going to look at extracting mileage, and I think for both sides, if we can, so we're not looking at anything big. We've been bogged down in, what next after the nuclear deal. But if you leave the nuclear deal aside, after that also we have moved ahead on a number of fronts. So I think steady progress, if we can maintain the momentum, that's good enough.
All right. On that note, Dr. Sekho and Ambassador Shankar, thank you so much for joining me in the discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Thank you. And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.